Albert Speer. Yeah, you know Albert Speer. He was Hitler's architect and later, bit crazily, his Minister for Armaments. You see him in that film Downfall, the one all the memes get made out of.
Ich war eher von der Akademie. Und doch habe ich allein auf mich gestellt.
Bitte gerne. Jetzt beruhig dich doch.
Speer is the one near the end who comes in and tells Hitler that for the last few months he hasn't been destroying German factories and bridges like he was ordered to. Pretty ballsy. And Hitler just waves him out of the room, essentially. There's no firing squad or anything for Speer. Because Speer was kind of Hitler's friend. I mean, Hitler didn't really have friends, certainly not after he became Der Führer. But if he took anyone under his wing, it was Speer. Speer himself wrote this, quote, "By the winter of 1933, I had been taken into the circle of Hitler's intimates. There were very few persons beside myself who had been so favoured. Hitler had undoubtedly taken a special liking to me, although I was by nature reticent and not very talkative. I have often asked myself whether he was projecting upon me his unfulfilled youthful dream of being a great architect. But given the fact that Hitler often acted in a purely intuitive way, why he took to me so warmly remains a mystery." End quote. Yeah, you know Speer. He was the Nazi that said sorry. At Nuremberg, he stood up and said, alright, fair cop. I done it. I screwed up. Fair dinkum. Fair dinkum. The dinkum is fair. I screwed the pooch on this one, guys, okay. But I didn't know the full extent of the horrors, and for my part, I'm sorry. Later shown not to have been the full story. He must have known more than he said he did. And somehow he got 20 years instead of a hanging. So he did his time in Spandau prison on the outskirts of Berlin, and later published his memoir, Inside the Third Reich. Now, if you want to read some sort of first-hand account of Hitler's inner circle, there aren't too many great options. There's the Goebbels diaries, Hitler's table talk, weird one-sided monologue thing, a set of monologues. There's obviously the accounts of people that were close to him, his drivers and his secretaries and things. There's the diaries of Count Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, which many historians quote with abandon, which is strange because he's been sort of fairly roundly debunked and shown not to have been in the places he says he was and things like that. But now, if you want a decent insight into Hitler's circle, as flawed and as suspect in its own way that it is, Speer's book is probably the best we'll ever get. So I read it and it's pretty long-winded, to be honest. There's loads of boring stuff all about his early life and architecture and art and stuff like that. Real snooze fest stuff. But then there are bits that are fascinating, incredible, occasionally even poignant. So I've gone ahead and picked out a few choice excerpts for you. It'll save you having to read the whole bloody tome. Alright, so here's a series of quotes from Speer's Inside the Third Reich. Quote, "About the beginning of August 1939, we, an untroubled group, drove with Hitler up to the Eagle's Nest. The long motorcade wound along the road which Bormann had blasted into the rock. Through a high bronze portal we entered a marble hall, damp from the moisture in the heart of the mountain, and stepped into the elevator of polished brass. As we rode up the 165 feet of shaft, Hitler said abruptly, as if he were talking to himself, 'Perhaps something enormously important will happen soon, even if I should have to send Goering. But if need be, I would even go myself. I am staking everything on this card.' There was no more beyond this hint. Barely 3 weeks later, on August 21st, 1939, we heard that the German foreign minister was in Moscow for some negotiations. During supper, a note was handed to Hitler. He scanned it, stared into space for a moment, flushed deeply, then banged on the table so hard that the glasses rattled, and exclaimed in a voice breaking with excitement, 'I have them! I have them!' Seconds later, he had already regained control of himself. No one dared ask any question, and the meal continued. After supper, Hitler called his entourage together. 'We are going to conclude a non-aggression pact with Russia. Here, read this, a telegram from Stalin.' It briefly acknowledged the agreement that had been reached. To see the names of Hitler and Stalin inked in friendship on a piece of paper was the most staggering, the most exciting turn of events I could possibly have imagined." End quote. Quote, Shortly after the end of the campaign in France, I received a telephone call from the office of the Führer's adjutant. I was to come to headquarters for a few days for a special purpose. Hitler had set up temporary headquarters in the small village of Beaulieu-le-Pêche, near Sedan. The village had been cleared of all inhabitants. The generals and adjutants were established in the small houses that lined the single village street. Hitler's own quarters in no way differed from those of the others. At my arrival he greeted me in the best of humours. "In a few days we are flying to Paris. I'd like you to be with us. Brecker and Giesler are coming along also." With that I was dismissed for the present, astonished that the victor had sent for 3 artists to accompany him on his entry into the French capital. That same evening I was invited to dine with Hitler's military circle. Details of the trip to Paris were discussed. This was not to be an official visit, I learned, but a kind of art tour by Hitler. This was the city, as he had so often said, which had fascinated him from his earliest years, so that he thought he would be able to find his way about the streets and important monuments as if he had lived there, solely from his endless studies of its plans. The armistice was to go into effect at 1:35 a.m. on June 25, 1940. That night we sat with Hitler round a deal table in the simple room of a peasant house. Shortly before the agreed time Hitler gave orders to turn out the light and open the windows. Silently we sat in the darkness, swept by the sense of experiencing a historic event so close to the author of it. Outside, a bugler blew the traditional signal for the end of fighting. A thunderstorm must have been brewing in the distance, for as in a bad novel, occasional flashes of heat lightning shimmered through the dark room. Someone, overcome by emotion, blew his nose. Then Hitler's voice sounded, soft and unemphatic. "This responsibility." And a few minutes later, "Now switch on the light." The trivial conversation continued, but for me it remained a rare event. I thought I had for once seen Hitler as a human being. End quote. Now here's a quote about the German atomic bomb project, which there's been lots talked about by all different people, but the reality was that they weren't really anywhere near doing that. So here's this quote. "Hitler had sometimes spoken to me about the possibility of an atomic bomb, but the idea quite obviously strained his intellectual capacity. He was also unable to grasp the revolutionary nature of nuclear physics. In the 2200 recorded points of my conferences with Hitler, nuclear fission came up only once, and then is mentioned with extreme brevity. Hitler did sometimes comment on its prospects, but what I told him of my conference with the physicists confirmed his view that there was not much profit in the matter. Actually, Professor Heisenberg had not given any final answer to my question whether a successful nuclear fission could be kept under control with absolute certainty, or might continue as a chain reaction. Hitler was plainly not delighted with the possibility that the Earth under his rule might be transformed into a glowing star. Occasionally, however, he joked that the scientists, in their unworldly urge to lay bare all the secrets under heaven, might someday set the globe on fire. But undoubtedly a good deal of time would pass before that came about, Hitler said. He would certainly not live to see it. I am sure that Hitler would not have hesitated for a moment to employ atom bombs against England. I remember his reaction to the final scene of a newsreel on the bombing of Warsaw in the autumn of 1939. We were sitting with him and Goebbels in his Berlin salon watching the film. Clouds of smoke darkened the sky. Dive bombers tilted and hurtled towards their goal. We could watch the flight of the released bombs, the pull-out of the planes and the cloud from the explosions expanding gigantically. The effect was enhanced by running the film in slow motion. Hitler was fascinated. The film ended with a montage showing a plane diving towards the outlines of the British Isles. A burst of flame followed, and the island flew into the air in tatters. Hitler's enthusiasm was unbounded. "That is what will happen to them," he cried out, carried away. "That is how we will annihilate them." On the suggestion of the nuclear physicists, we scuttled the project to develop an atom bomb by the autumn of 1942, after I had again queried them about deadlines and been told that we could not count on anything for 3 or 4 years. The war would certainly have been decided long before then. End quote. Yeah, so there you go. They were nowhere near getting the atomic bomb. So okay, one last excerpt that stood out for me. Quote, On June 22nd, 1944, almost at the same time as the Anglo-American invasion was achieving its first great successes, a Soviet offensive was initiated, which was soon to lead to the loss of 25 German divisions. Now the Red Army's advance could no longer be halted, even in the summer. There can be no question that during these weeks, when three fronts were collapsing, in the west, in the east and in the air, Hitler demonstrated steady nerves and an astonishing capacity for perseverance. No doubt the long struggle for power, with its many setbacks, had hardened his will, as it had of Goebbels and others of his followers of that period. Perhaps the experiences of the time of struggle, as it was always called, had taught him not to show the slightest anxiety in the presence of his associates. His entourage admired the composure he displayed at critical moments. That alone contributed greatly to the confidence placed in his decisions. Obviously, he was always conscious of the many eyes watching him and knew what discouragement he would have set in motion if he had lost his composure even for a moment. This self-control remained an extraordinary act of will to the last. He wrung it from himself in spite of his rapid ageing, in spite of illness, in spite of Morell's experiments, and in spite of the ever greater burdens under which he staggered. His will often seemed to me as heedless and crude as that of a 6-year-old child whom nothing can discourage or tire. But although it was in some ways ridiculous, it also commanded respect. This phenomenal confidence in victory in a period of repeated defeats cannot, however, be explained on the grounds of his energy alone. In Spandau prison, Funk confided to me that the one reason he, Funk, was able to deceive the doctors so consistently and credibly about his health was that he believed his own lies. He added that this attitude had been the basis of Goebbels' propaganda. Similarly, I can only explain Hitler's rigid attitude on the grounds that he made himself believe in his ultimate victory. In a sense, he was worshipping himself. He was forever holding up to himself a mirror in which he saw not only himself but also the confirmation of his mission by divine providence. His religion was based on the lucky break, which must necessarily come his way. His method was to reinforce himself by autosuggestion. The more events drove him into a corner, the more obstinately he opposed to them his certainty about the intentions of fate. Naturally, he also soberly understood the military facts, but he transmitted them by his own faith and regarded even defeat as a secret guarantee offered by Providence of the coming victory. Sometimes he could realise the hopelessness of a situation, but he could not be shaken in his expectation that at the last moment fate would suddenly turn the tide in his favour. If there was any fundamental insanity in Hitler, it was this unshakable belief in his lucky star." End quote.